It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. The US Secretary of State tells Sky News he's not ruling out allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons to fire deep into Russia.
We never rule out, but when we rule in, we want to make sure it's done in such a way that it can advance what the Ukrainians are trying to achieve.
Get out of jail early. Hundreds of prisoners are released to try to ease overcrowding in England and Wales. The vast majority of pensioners will lose their winter fuel allowance as the Prime Minister tells the unions he'll make no apology for tough choices. Head-to-head on live TV, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump prepare to face off in their first presidential debate. A coroner concludes there was no clear link between the Jeremy Kyle show and a guest's suicide days later. Plus, liftoff for SpaceX, one small step for man and one giant leap for the latest private mission financed by a billionaire. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's in our press preview from 10:30. Hello, good evening. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has told Sky News in an exclusive interview that he won't rule out sending long-range ballistic missiles to Ukraine so they can strike deep into Russian territory. America's top diplomat today formally accused Iran of delivering short-range missiles to Moscow, saying Kremlin forces would likely use them within weeks. And today, at a news conference in London with the Foreign Secretary, a surprise joint visit to Kyiv this week was announced as the Prime Minister prepares to fly to Washington to meet President Biden. Here's Yalda Hakim.
The start of a week of diplomacy and a chance to prove the special relationship still is special. The United States' top diplomat in London to meet a new British Prime Minister. All smiles, but this a tense time for Antony Blinken, the last months of Joe Biden's presidency and two wars raging on with no end in sight. He'd already met his British counterpart, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy. And with both men set to visit Ukraine this week, the Allies announced new sanctions on Tehran over its transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia.
Russia has now received shipments of these ballistic missiles and will likely use them within weeks in Ukraine against Ukrainians.
And with the threat to Ukraine still as pressing as ever, questions now over how far Kyiv's Western allies will allow it to defend itself.
The Ukrainians are pushing to be able to use long-range missiles deep into Russian territory. Is this something now that President Biden is not going to rule out? Is it on the table?
We have adjusted and we've adapted, trying to make sure that Ukraine had what it needed, when it needed it, to be effective in repelling the Russian aggression. We never rule out, but when we rule in, we want to make sure it's done in such a way that it can advance what the Ukrainians are trying to achieve.
But the question most pressing for Mr. Blinken, how long can the destruction in Gaza continue?
Do you think that you will reach some kind of agreement before President Biden's term is up?
The fierce urgency of now is real for every individual who is suffering as a consequence of this conflict. Leaders have to make decisions. We can't make those decisions for them. You can pressure, you can reason, you can do all sorts of things, but you can't, fundamentally, you can't make the decision. They have to make it, and we're looking to them to do exactly that.
But the fact is, a lot of Palestinians are dying.
It's horrific. The suffering of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza is gut-wrenching, and it hits me every day, and I think most of us think of our own children. It's the responsibility of those of us who are in the business of diplomacy to keep striving for that one day of success, because the stakes are so high that we simply can't throw up our hands and say it's not possible.
He's all too often been accused of falling short in keeping America's enemies and allies in check. And with an election looming and the prospect of a seismic political change in Washington just weeks away, the question now, will his efforts have been in vain? Yalda Hakim, Sky News.
Speak now to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, who's at the Foreign Office. So, Dominic, a joint trip to Kyiv announced, the Prime Minister heading to Washington later this week. Should we be reading anything into all of this?
Well, Anna, I think there are two things going on here. First of all, there's this sequence of events choreographed to culminate in Keir Starmer meeting Joe Biden at the White House on Friday, and that's all about renewing the special relationship vows, if you like, between Britain and America, and that's all predictable, really, at the beginning of a new British government. And it's clear that David Lammy and Antony Blinken have a kind of affinity and a warmth between them, and they'll work on that as they travel to Kyiv. But what else is going on here, of course, is basically things are being overshadowed by things going from bad to worse in Ukraine. You have the fate of the city Pokrovsk, which is a crucial transport hub in the east of the country that Russia is closing in on. If they take Pokrovsk, they will effectively have the entire Donetsk region within their grasp, because the Ukrainians will have to pull up possibly from Chasiv Yar to the north of there, and they won't be able to supply their front lines. And that will give Vladimir Putin, within his hands, at least within his grasp, potentially one of the key war aims that he's been aiming for 2.5 years of this conflict. You also have the arrival of these Iranian ballistic missiles. That has been dreaded by the Ukrainians, and we had a warning over the weekend from the CIA head saying that this would be a dramatic escalation. The response to that so far has been anything but dramatic. Pretty limited sanctions on 3 Iranian officials, travel bans, asset freezes on 3 people who probably don't have any assets here or intentions to travel here, and sanctions on a few organisations and ships as well. But there is a real sense, I think, that is the beginning of something more. And we had a hint there to Yalda, but also to me in the press conference earlier in the building behind me, the Foreign Office this morning, from Antony Blinken, suggesting that they are thinking about, certainly discussing with their Ukrainian allies, the possibility of letting them use what they've wanted to do for a long time now, these long-range missiles that the West are giving them, but are restricting the way they can use them. They're not able to strike the source of these glide bomb attacks deep within Russia. Now, I think there's a sense that is shifting, but possibly not this week. But it's certainly moving in a certain direction. And I think we'll watch very closely to see where those discussions go with President Zelensky as these 2 men travel to Kyiv. And I think it has to be said, without some major shift in the kind of help the Ukrainians are being given, but also the way they can use that help, things are moving very much against them. And if Donetsk was to fall in the coming weeks and months, that would be disastrous for the Ukrainians, but also, of course, for Joe Biden in the last couple of months of his presidency.
Lots to look for there. Dominic, thank you very much indeed. Now, prisons in England and Wales are now so overcrowded that hundreds of inmates have had to be released early. The government insists that plans are in place to manage those heading back into the community, but many are warning it is inevitable that some will reoffend. Well, the prison population hit a record high of 88,521 across England and Wales at the end of last week. That is more than 99.5% of available capacity. About 1,700 prisoners were released in addition to the 1,000 inmates normally freed each week. It's hoped the scheme will free up space for 5,500 offenders. Our home editor, Jason Farrell, has this report.
Released into freedom early, only because behind these walls the system is at breaking point.
This place is crowded in there, man. It's crazy, man, yeah?
As soon as the space comes out on the wing, whatever wing you're on, whatever space comes up, it's filled within minutes.
There wasn't one space on the wing, not one space.
It's a chance to turn their lives around or go back to their old ways.
Do you think you've turned your back on crime?
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
You guarantee you won't be back in?
Yeah, man, you're not going to see me back here still.
You have to rehabilitate yourself in there.
Yeah?
I did that. I changed, yeah.
I don't want to reoffend. I don't think I'll reoffend, like, as in committing crime, but getting recalled, probably 99%, yeah.
What he means is he expects to break his parole conditions and get sent back. And how often that happens is just one variable that will determine whether this scheme can turn around the woeful situation in our crowded jails.
This couldn't be more unpopular with the public, but the Justice Secretary told me that the alternative was unthinkable. Doing nothing would break the justice system because judges wouldn't be able to sentence new criminals because there would be nowhere to house them.
But releasing hundreds of prisoners applies pressure in other places.
Our members would do their level best to ensure that public safety is paramount in processing an early release, but I can't stand here and say it's not without risk. So one of the problems is that we weren't widely consulted or appropriately consulted on the mechanics of the scheme.
The early releases happen in 2 batches. Those with sentences below 5 years released today, longer sentences in late October. 2 pinch points on the system.
Like the other prison officers just told me, they said, like, the prisoners they're letting out now are taking up all the cash housing. So I think it's 22nd of October when they're letting out the rest. There's no housing for them.
For most crimes, there is a victim. And while killers, terrorists and sex offenders will not be released early, some domestic abusers are coming out. Elizabeth Hudson received this letter from the Ministry of Justice saying her ex-husband, who assaulted and threatened to kill her, is eligible for release.
How on earth can you say that you're putting the safety of women and girls front and centre of your policy making when you're prepared to let incredibly violent men out without even serving half of an inadequate sentence in the first place?
Inmates have discarded their prison clothes, but will they change? The Chief Inspector of Prisons described this scheme as risky. Will it be a risk worth taking? The government says it had no choice. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Millions of pensioners are to lose the winter fuel payment after the government won a vote comfortably in the House of Commons. Labour's large majority meant the Prime Minister saw off challenges to block the measure, but more than 50 of his own MPs abstained on the vote. And Keir Starmer had a rather bleak message for the unions at the TUC conference in Brighton. Here's our political editor, Beth Rigby.
At last, a Labour Prime Minister. This is what the trade union movement has yearned for. A patient base waiting for a new deal.
Let me again be crystal clear. We will repeal the 2016 Trade Union Act, get rid of minimum service level legislation, and turn the page on politics as noisy once and for all.
A pledge for stronger unions prompting applause. But look at their faces and you can see they're not sold on Starmer and the decisions he's taking.
Your government has not scrapped the 2-child benefit cap. What alternative urgent measures are you therefore taking to immediately alleviate the poverty experienced by 4.3 million children across the UK?
Starmer upstage from the floor, perhaps not the reception he hoped for. If you want a sense of the changed government, this is it. Keir Starmer is the first Prime Minister in 15 years to address the Trade Union Congress, but already his message on stronger unions and better workers' rights has been drowned out about his warnings on tough decisions around public sector pay and spending cuts. Not much euphoria here, despite the end to Conservative rule. Old allies already at odds.
He's putting a message out which is consistent, that he's going to be firm. But we want him to be fair as well with that. And the misstep that we think he's made with the treatment of the pensioners is something that we all have to reflect on.
Do you think he's, at the moment, like a version of a George Osborne Austerity 2.0?
You keep talking about tough choices. There's only one way that you can think about that he's moving towards cuts. That will mean austerity Mark II. The country will not allow or accept austerity Mark II.
From an unaffectionate Congress to a fired-up Commons, more of the same.
I was not elected to impoverish my constituents and put them in this hardship.
Labour MPs in rebellion over the decision to cut support for pensioners' winter fuel bills.
The noes were 348, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlawful.
An easy win for the PM with his massive majority, but a divisive one nevertheless. 52 MPs abstaining from the vote.
Our slogan for the general election campaign was change. It's starting to sound a lot as though our slogan should have been the same, because we're doing the things that we fought against for so long, and I can't, in all good conscience, vote to make people poorer.
The PM's big majority rests on shallow support, and with the honeymoon over, the rows now begin. Number 10 hope the country will give Starmer the benefit of the doubt, even if his base might not. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Now tonight, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will debate each other and indeed meet each other for the first time. The TV head-to-head is designed to persuade those still undecided, with the election less than 2 months away. Our US correspondent Mark Stone reports now from Philadelphia, where the clash is set to take place.
Face-to-face, historic.
There is an only in America vibe around all this.
And tonight, Rachel...
Anticipation, energy, jeopardy. The circus has rolled into Philadelphia for the mother of all presidential debates.
The candidates will meet face-to-face for the first time.
And it is certainly the case that with the polls so tight and the options so stark, there is a lot riding on the two candidates who will stand here tonight.
How are you feeling?
Kamala Harris has been prepping on the road between campaign rallies. Donald Trump cut this weekend campaigning short for an extensive prep session at his Florida resort, and the rally routine hints at his pitch.
Stupid, stupid people. And we found that out at the debate with Joe. How did that work out?
Of course, we all remember how it worked out. It was the beginning of the end for President Biden, a performance which precipitated Harris's unchallenged rise.
That someone with the temperament
Trump has been here before, many times. Unpredictable, blunt.
Because you'd be in jail.
On brand. Harris has had far less of this, but it is perhaps her poise.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking.
And prosecutorial background that could knock Trump off his stride. But it's not really here in democratic Philadelphia that all this matters. It is instead in the harder to reach, harder to win rural parts of tight states like this.
I'm probably edging towards Trump, just because I've grown up in a rural area and his beliefs more align with my beliefs, I would say.
In small towns like Oxford, nods to the key election issues are everywhere. Just a few votes one way or the other in places like this could swing the nation left or right.
I know if Kamala gets in, it'll be the same chaos that's been going on for the past 3.5 years.
So has she got any opportunity to change your mind? I mean, could she impress you?
Pretty much made up, but I'm not going to say no.
What does she need to do to make you convinced that she can run the country?
Well, she needs to speak up on what this country needs. And now, when I watched Trump the other night, he shot everybody down and didn't seem to like he wanted to do anything for the country.
And so we know just how consequential these debates can be, and in just a few hours this spin room will be full, and with surrogates from both sides trying to insist their candidate was the winner.
Trump will frame Harris as continuity Biden, not the change that the country seems to want. He will emphasize her flip-flops. She was certainly once far more to the left than she is pitching herself now. He'll need to hold his temper too, as she frames him as the past, the danger, not the future she thinks she can offer. She will need poise and she will need policy if she's to counter the combatant we all know.
This race to the presidency will pass through a gauntlet tonight. Mark Stone, Sky News in Philadelphia.
Well, let's go live to another of our US correspondents in Philadelphia, James Matthews. We heard it there, Joe Biden learning just how savage the response to these debates can be, James. It really has raised the stakes and the jeopardy for both nominees tonight.
Yeah, huge stakes. The most important TV debate since the last set-piece occasion we saw, as Mark pointed out, what that did to Joe Biden completely upended the contest. Speaking of Biden, he was asked just in the past hour about his conversation, which he had today with Kamala Harris. He wouldn't say what advice he gave to her, said he's going to his granddaughters, will watch the debate, said that she is cool, calm and collected. She will have to be. Harris tonight is all about introducing herself to the American public, many of whom are relatively unfamiliar with her. She will want to score in policy areas, Anna, like abortion, like Project 25, the hard right project she says Donald Trump is a part of. He denies it. She will want to get under Donald Trump's skin. He is a man who is prone to venting his irritation. He can be visibly frustrated and angry on stage. We've seen that. We saw it in 2020 against Joe Biden when he admits himself he lost the debate, kept interrupting Biden, suffered in the polls because of that. He has learned his lesson. He's going into his 7th presidential debate, Kamala Harris going into her first. I tell you one thing he won't be happy with in the past hour, Anna. We've learned that the podiums on stage will be of different height to accommodate the shorter Kamala Harris. She's 5'4". Donald Trump had already complained about that, fully aware as he is of the optical advantage that would give him towering over his opponent.
Interesting, James. Thank you for that. And we'll have more on this later in the show too. James, for now, thank you. Well, immigration will no doubt be a battleground in tonight's debate, and whoever becomes the next president could introduce drastic changes to America's border policy. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, has been to Matamoros in Mexico, hearing from those trying to cross the border before the polls close.
They've been queuing from dawn in what is arguably one, if not the most important day of their lives. They're migrants heading for the United States. They're here on the Texas border for their entry interview to America. After months, even years on the road, this is it, their final chance. They may be unaware of it, but these immigrants are at the centre of one of the most hotly debated, even divisive issues of this US presidential election. And on this issue, Trump beats Harris in the polls, and it will be a critical issue in the TV debate. The walkway crosses the Rio Grande, the border between the two countries. They're now a few steps away from America. Many can't believe it. US border guards check their papers, and they are through. Those children, these families, are about to start a new life. People from Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua and Cuba make up the vast majority of those who are taking part in what is basically a legal movement across the border. That's the United States just there. Many have been travelling for months and months to get here. This is their moment. They're going to come for an appointment, but once you've got this far, short of a massive change in your circumstances, you will go through to the United States. There's little sign of Donald Trump's border wall here, but he'd doubtless approve of the razor wire fortifications between Mexico's Matamoros city and Brownsville in Texas. Experts here say that there's no doubt who those seeking asylum are backing in this election and this debate. You know, there are migrants here. Are all of them thinking all the time there's an election coming and we need to get across the border as soon as possible?
Yeah, I think it's the same situation when Biden won the elections. All the migrant people in the borders, especially in this Tamaulipas, Texas border, they were waiting for a new hope, open doors in the borders. That maybe will be the same situation if Harris win the presidential United States.
And they're all watching, yeah? They're all watching and waiting and listening.
Yeah, of course, yeah, sure.
In shelters and hostels across Mexico, migrant families simply have to wait for their border appointment. It's like a lottery, and it can take a long time for their number to come up. They are stuck here. Few go outside. They're easy prey for cartel gangs who kidnap and hold them for ransom. Marlene Cabrera and her family are from Honduras. They've been waiting for an appointment for 7 months. The only male amongst them is the baby. Any tightening of the immigration rules, as threatened by Donald Trump, would be for them a disaster.
He estado tanto tiempo aquí y no poder entrar.
I've been here so long, and not being able to get in would be hard, because it's the only option I have. I have to get in. It would be really terrible if we couldn't. And I don't just speak for myself, I speak for everyone here.
Day in, day out, in any weather, the migrants line up for their appointment here. The presidential debate and the election in the United States is never far from their minds. For those who follow them, what happens in a country just a few meters away will change their lives forever. It could be good, or it could be bad. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Matamoros, Mexico.
The inquest of a man who took his own life a week after appearing on the Jeremy Kyle show has concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prove that the programme was responsible. Steve Diamond failed a lie detector test during filming for the show and was booed by a live studio audience as he broke down in tears. Our entertainment correspondent Katie Spencer was at Winchester Coroner's Court.
My next guest today, Jane, is here to find out whether her partner Steve has indeed cheated on her.
Over the course of 17 series, millions tuned in to watch Jeremy Kyle unpick the messy personal lives of his guests. This was the episode which saw it taken off air.
Just so you're aware, you failed every single question. Oh my God, I was never unfaithful.
While Steve Diamond was left visibly distressed after failing a lie detector test during the recording, a coroner has ruled that there's insufficient evidence it was a direct cause of his death. 7 days after taking part, he took his own life. While those closest to the 63-year-old said he was left distraught over the experience, the coroner citing Diamond's history of mental health problems, self-harm and previous suicide attempts as factors.
I find it quite interesting. I'm really sorry. You're better than that, by the way.
With hindsight, some critics have come to paint Jeremy Kyle as the devil incarnate for interactions like these. But the coroner finding there was no evidence that his words were a direct cause of distress. In a statement, Jeremy Kyle has said, out of respect for Steve Diamond's family, he's remained steadfastly silent in the face of lies, false accusations and unfair criticism over the last 5.5 years. And that's taken a huge toll on him and his family. Through lawyers, Steve Diamond's son, Carl, responding with this.
The only good thing that came of my father's death is the Jeremy Kyle show is cancelled.
I have not been unfaithful to her. Why'd you fail the test?
While Diamond had rung ITV 40 to 50 times in desperate attempts to be allowed on the show, the broadcaster keen to stress the coroner's findings that it had comprehensive duty of care processes in place for guests, both during and after filming. TV tastes might have changed substantially, but Steve Diamond's inquest, a reminder of how it's all too easy for millions of us to tune in without thinking twice about the impact on those taking part. Katie Spencer, Sky News in Winchester. And a reminder that there is help available from the Samaritans 24 hours a day by calling 116 123, or you can email joe@samaritans.org. Now, the inquiry into the Lucy Letby murders has begun. It will examine how Letby was able to attack babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital and how its bosses handled concerns about her. Letby is serving 15 whole life terms after being found guilty of the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 7 more. Lady Justice Thirlwell's inquiry is expected to last until the end of the year. Mel Stride has become the second Conservative MP to be knocked out of the party leadership contest, joining Dame Priti Patel. The second round of voting put Robert Jenrick in front with 33 votes, ahead of Kemi Badenoch with 28, though she made the most gains compared to the first round. James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat won 21 votes each. Buckingham Palace has confirmed the programme for the King's first overseas tour since his cancer diagnosis. Charles and Queen Camilla will spend time in Australia before heading to Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. He stood in for his late mother at the last Commonwealth meeting in Rwanda 2 years ago. This will be his first, though, as head of state. Now, a SpaceX rocket has blasted off from Florida with a mission to travel deeper into space than any other attempt in more than half a century. Polaris Dawn has made its journey into orbit with 4 people on board, one of whom is a billionaire who's paid for the mission privately. Here's our science and technology correspondent, Thomas Moore.
Dragon SpaceX, we are beginning seat rotation.
They look the part, but these are civilian astronauts.
4, 3, 2, 1, ignition.
Cheered on by watching colleagues, they blasted into the Florida sky on a SpaceX rocket. Only the commander has been to space before, just once. The rest are novices.
Welcome to orbit.
Message received. We appreciate the kind words. We're going to get to work now.
Despite their inexperience, they will attempt the first daring spacewalk by a privately funded crew, led by the billionaire bankrolling the mission.
Organizations like SpaceX and others in commercial space are making it possible where hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people are going to go to space someday. You know, if you are thinking about or dreaming about being an astronaut someday, it is totally possible. You do not have to be one of the lucky few struck by lightning.
This is the first of 3 Polaris Dawn expeditions. Over 5 days, the astronauts will orbit further from Earth than any crew since Apollo, and then they'll depressurize their capsule and float into the vacuum of space, testing life-preserving suits designed for the first missions to Mars.
The environment of space and space travel is changing. It is opening up to new commercial players and new commercial actors, and we're seeing that in this privately funded space mission. To be able to access space, to develop new technologies, to enable research that will ultimately benefit everybody back on Earth.
The crew have been training for 2.5 years, but they still have a steep learning curve in zero gravity. They should undertake more than 30 experiments, many on themselves, before splashing down off the Florida coast. Thomas Moore, Sky News.
Now, Harry Kane has won his 100th cap for England tonight. He's only the 10th player to reach that milestone and the first since Wayne Rooney, earning him a commemorative cap. England beat Finland on the night 2-0 in the Nations League, with Kane scoring both of those goals. Now, returning to tonight's debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, a moment that could prove pivotal in their battle for the White House. My colleagues Yalda Hakim and Mark Austin will bring you a special Sky News programme from midnight. Evening to both of you.
Evening, Anna. And as you say, the first debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And Mark, we know what happened last time. I mean, these debates are consequential. Yes. When Joe Biden stood across or next to Donald Trump, I mean, he was pushed out.
Yes, he was. I mean, it could be a big moment. And it's interesting because we've both been to conventions. You at the Republican one, I went to the Democrat convention. And this was razzmatazz, this was entertainment, this was showbiz. And at the end, the leaders were sort of cheered to the rafters. This is, in a way, when it gets real, you know, face-to-face, head-to-head, potentially make or break.
And the polls show that Americans don't just want the entertainment. They don't want the greatest show on earth. No. They want actual policy. They want to know who Kamala Harris is. And I think that the big challenge for Kamala Harris is to tell the American people who she is before Donald Trump does.
Right. So huge jeopardy for both candidates, Anna. And we will be live from midnight with a Sky News special programme, coverage of the debate. So if you can, do stay up for us.
Mark, Yalda, thank you. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, joined by the CEO of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace, and the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Soda. Great to see both of you. And certainly among the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front of the eye, the headline, Starmer and Reeves to push ahead with cuts after facing down rebel MPs. That and plenty more after this break.
significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
They want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Well, this is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, a reminder of our top stories this evening. In an interview with Sky News while in London, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said he won't rule out sending long-range ballistic missiles to Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia. More than 1,700 inmates have been released early to ease prison overcrowding in England and Wales. And White House rivals Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are preparing for their first and potentially only televised debate tonight ahead of November's election. Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the CEO of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace, and the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Soda. How hard can it be? So let's take a look at the front pages then, shall we? Starting with the Eye, reports that having pushed cuts to winter fuel payments through Parliament, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are now poised to introduce further controversial proposals on tax and spending. The Guardian leads on the story too, reporting the Prime Minister is facing calls to aid the poorest after the new cuts have been approved. Daily Express reports on campaigners against the measures, saying united we stand in winter fuel fight. The Telegraph's headline, President poised to lift Ukraine missile ban. The Metro carries reaction from former chat show host Jeremy Kyle to the coroner's inquest into treatment of guests on his programme. He says it's taken a huge toll on him. The Financial Times reports that the European Court of Justice has ordered Apple to pay €13 billion in back taxes to the Irish government. The Mirror hears that BBC staff working on Strictly Come Dancing were forced to hand over their phones as part of an investigation into alleged backstage misconduct. Daily Star asks, will fans get the happy ending they crave as the final episode of Gavin and Stacey is filmed? A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you listen to our guests. So let's head straight to Mark and to Sonia. Welcome to both of you. Big domestic stories today. I was wondering if this was the most challenging day yet for Sir Keir Starmer and his Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Mark, what do you think after the vote in the Commons on winter fuel and, of course, the prisoners' release?
Yes, and this vote, there is something the government have chosen to do, is really their first serious hurdle. And yes, they won the vote. They won it hands down. They were always going to win the vote because they've got about 4 million MPs. And they can afford, to some extent, in arithmetic terms, to like the Red Army, you basically got what you lack in strategic...
Did you say Red Army?
Yes, what you lack in strategic opportunity. You can kind of have a human wave of MPs and throw them at the problem. So that was never in doubt. But this doesn't mean it's not an issue for the government. I mean, the fact is that this is about austerity. This is the first vote, effectively, the first trial moment for the new government's austerity programme. And that's going to split into, as George Osborne's austerity did, tax rises, which are a form of austerity, and spending cuts. We don't know what their mix is going to be. We'll find out in the budget. But there's going to be a lot more of this to come. And fine, MPs who stayed away, 50 MPs abstained, some of whom just won't have been able to be there, but a lot have abstained. One sitting current whip-holding Labour MP rebelled. But MPs who are forced through the lobby in support of the government, some of whom reported to have tears in their eyes, etc., they're in the right lobby today, but that is burning up political capital in the coming months and years they are going to need. And you saw that in the coalition. It's very hard to hold your movement behind you. Unions coming out against them, MPs, ministers clearly unhappy. So they won. But each little bit of this is government, it's attrition, it slowly costs you and starting to chip away already.
Yeah, certainly, nearly scores, threw themselves into the Red Army's trenches, if I can put it that way. But does the government fundamentally want to be seen as George Osborne 2.0 here? And that's the way they're starting to be billed. We haven't even had the budget.
Yeah, they definitely don't want to be seen as George Osborne, and I think they've actually reacted quite defensively to that sort of critique, which is, you're just the Tories, but a bit nicer. And I don't think that, to be fair...
It's nothing to do with being the Tories, it's about saying exactly the same things, isn't it?
Well, it's about taking the same strategy, fiscally, that George Osborne and David Cameron took in 2010, i.e. a strategy of fiscal conservatism. Now, to be fair to them, they're not doing what the Conservatives did. We saw successive Conservative chancellors actually take benefits and tax credits away from some of the poorest households with children and actually deliver tax cuts, very expensive tax cuts that disproportionately went to the top half of the distribution. So that distributionally was very, very bad for the lowest income households. But there are some shades of that here, which is what Labour MPs are worried about. And I think the debate in the Labour Party is, OK, we ran on a platform of fiscal conservatism in the general election. What does that mean when we actually get into government? What does it mean in terms of how much we have to cut back because things are worse when we get into government than we thought they were? And who should bear that cost? And the thing is, when you take something like winter fuel payment, I think there's a lot of agreement across the piece, actually, that the very wealthiest pensioners don't really need this payment. The question is, how do you means test it and how much money do you save? So I think there's a lot of Labour MPs who'd have been quite comfortable if you'd said, the top sort of 40% of pensioners aren't going to get this payment. I think people would have felt better about that. The issue is that there's quite a harsh cut-off with this policy. Now, going forwards, and this is what The Guardian's focusing on, interestingly, as Mark says they've won this vote, but there are going to be calls from backbenchers for support for those pensioners who aren't well off, but who just don't make the pension credit threshold, or who, even worse, are eligible for means-tested pension credit, but aren't claiming it.
The pension credit has a horrible cliff edge.
It does.
And loads of people don't claim it, but if they all did claim it, this would be a lost leader. And that's the accusation we heard from Mel Stride, for the opposition today.
It is. It's a really difficult one, because I think Rachel Reeves, if she was here, she would say, we need to give a tough message as a Labour government. The economic inheritance is dire, and I'm not going to be borrowing
making people snooze. I mean, literally, people can't bear hearing that anymore.
I'm just giving you what she...
I know, but I just wonder when they start putting a full stop at the end of that, because people have already had enough of it.
Well, I think the problem is, OK, for Labour is that they could... I do think that voters know that the Conservatives are partially to blame for the economic situation as it stands, and we saw that in the general election result. The thing is, in 5 years' time, they're not going to be blaming the Conservatives for where the country is. And the risk for Labour is, what is their plan for growth? Personally, I don't think fiscal conservatism cuts it in terms of delivering growth for the country. If the economy is not doing significantly better, I think, by the time of the next election, I think Labour probably still will win.
People aren't looking at the next election, they're looking at Christmas, and they're looking at whether they can pay their energy bills, and they're going up by 10%. That's the problem they've got. We know that pensions are going up. We heard today £460 a year from April. That misses the winter, obviously. Indexed to wages and inflation. The Office for National Statistics announcing that average earnings rose by 4% year on year in the 3 months to July. So does that mean they're going up, by that amount? Is it September that they set these figures? So, so great news eventually, but you've still got to get through the winter.
Yes, and if you're a new MP, if you've just arrived, you've achieved... people have to work incredibly hard to become MPs. It's their big dream to get to sit on those green benches. They've had this amazing election result. They've achieved this bit of the dream. And what's happening now is reality starts to bite, that this is really hard. Your mailbag is not filling with people saying, I'm looking forward to £460 on my pension in April or March. It's filling with people writing to you right now about this, particularly
people on the front page of the Daily Express, for example, united we stand in winter fuel fight. That means the fight's going to carry on.
Indeed, and in that photo you have a couple of Tory leadership contenders, Tory MPs, Nigel Farage, the Green Party. There's a lot of kind of clamour about this, and it's very easy, as the opposition will, all opposition parties will understandably do, they'll oppose, they'll hammer you over this. And it's quite interesting to think about the ideology. We used to hear a lot from MPs and campaigns now in government that, you remember the phrase, austerity is an ideological choice, not a necessity? We don't hear that very much anymore. And their message now is, understandably, this is a necessity, not an ideological choice after all, because you're the government, you're charged with actually balancing the books and making this stuff work out. George Osborne's split in the coalition years was 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises. That was his stated strategy. Budgets varied a lot around whether he kept to that at different times. We'll find out from Rachel Reeves. Maybe it'll be 50-50, maybe some other balance. But it's really difficult. You know, Conservative MPs who are much more on board with the necessity of austerity in 2010 than I would say a lot of Labour MPs are now, they all struggled to hold the line with their constituents, with their pet topics. This is going to get a lot harder, a lot more bumpy before it gets easier.
And in the meantime, prisoner release, again, they're blaming the Conservatives for this point, and they possibly Rishi Sunak bottled this decision before the election, that it was always going to... They'd already started cutting it, haven't they? Daily Mail says...
I think this is one situation where it's completely...
Let's just look at the picture, though, in the Daily Mail. Cork popping, champagne bubbling. Who voted for all of this?
And their sentence, they opened Keir Starmer mugged pensioners and freed muggers yesterday. I mean, that's not something you want to hear in Downing Street. You don't want that in the Prime Minister's roundup.
You definitely don't want prisoners coming out and saying, I'm a Labour voter for life now, which is what one of them has done. So,
well, some are saying I'm sleeping on the street and I'll be back in soon, too, to be fair.
Absolutely. And I do think that this is actually one case where it is entirely fair to blame the last government for this, because this prisons crisis has been years in the making. We've not built enough prisons, and we have underinvested in the prison service. We made a lot of experienced prison officers redundant about, sort of 2015, 2016. You've got prisons that are quite dangerous, that are underfunded, and we've been locking up people for longer. Now, that might be the right decision for some crimes, but you've got to make sure that there's space for these people. So this is a problem.
This is the problem of heading back into austerity, that where is the money to stop, the prisons crisis, the NHS crisis?
Absolutely. Well, this is why it comes back to growth in the economy, because Rachel Reeves' answer to this is always, we don't have the money to spend right now, but we're going to grow the economy and that will deliver the tax receipts we need to spend. But if that growth doesn't come, these are all very, very difficult questions.
So I very much agree that this problem was established and created under the previous government. The fact is, we didn't build enough prisons. The rehabilitation is failing. It has been for a very long time. We need to do more of it. We have people who go into our prisons clean and come out with drug habits. That's a clear sign of a really disastrous system. And there's, if you want to understand one reason why Rishi Sunak went early for the election, stuff like this is part of it. He would be deciding. But I've got to say,
Just quickly, Mark, because
But the new government, we could build Nightingale hospitals. Why can't we set up some Nightingale prisons? Why can't we find some Bibi Stockholms and put prisoners there? I mean, it doesn't... I think it feels like they've moved quite swiftly to release, to me.
No, I've got time. We're not going back Bibi Stockholming on this point. Run out of time for the moment. Stay tuned, though. Lots more still to come, including this critical question. Could the US allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike Russia? Discussing that next.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'll have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here.
They are coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake, might all be finished, I don't know.
say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win, win, win. Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first.
Here we go. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. We're still debating the previous section. It's been a hard 3 minutes. Anyway, still here, as you can see, Mark Wallace and Sonia Soda. We'll have a chance to talk more later, obviously. Anyway, really big story in the Times, which is that there are things coalescing together. There is a joint trip between the US and UK to Kyiv. We know the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is heading to Washington at the back end of this week. Is there an announcement brewing? And, Mark, Kyiv to get the go-ahead to strike deep into Russia. Finally, the suggestion is that they might be able to use Western missiles to strike Russia, which has been halted so far. Is this what we're expecting?
Yes, and let's hope it happens and it happens soon, because the whole story of this war, since the end of the first week, has been Ukraine saying, look what we can do with what we have, look what we could do with what we need, and America and NATO, and in some cases Britain, but particularly Germany and others, dragging their feet and making the Ukrainians, essentially saying to the Ukrainians, in not so many words, but you have to bleed more until we're willing to do this. And they need to get on with it. It's interesting, Kyiv, the Ukrainians have launched their own drone strikes on Moscow to illustrate what they can do. Yeah. Imagine what they should be given this.
Warehouses building drones. I mean, it's truly, I think, a frightening prospect for modern warfare. Daily Telegraph also leading on this. President poised to lift Ukraine missile ban. And the Ukrainians would say, that's not it, that's on the front page of the Telegraph. The Ukrainians would say, if you'd given us what you've given us now, F-16s, Abrams, Bradleys, Challengers, the prospect of long-range missiles into Russia, look what we could have done 2 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think those are some of the difficult questions that need to be asked of the West strategy, actually. And the thing that has prompted this at this moment in time is that Iran have just supplied some new missiles to Russia, which everyone is expecting Russia to use. And that sort of prompted this kind of potential change in policy for the West. But the fact of the matter is that the UK has supplied Ukraine with long-range missiles. The issue is that they require some US technology as well in order to go into Russia. And it's the US who's been holding back. Now, you can see why there are arguments for holding back, which is that
the question is, are we at war with Russia?
Exactly,
that's
exactly. So the US and the UK and France and Germany are very, very nervous about doing something that could trigger Putin using strategic tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine and could ultimately catapult us all into World War III. But the current situation that we're in is not really risk-free either, and is, has potential long-term ramifications. So I agree. I really do hope that Ukraine gets what it needs. And the key point is that this would be using missiles to hit Russian military targets to prevent Russia's capacity to strike Ukraine using long-range missiles way beyond the front line, which is what it's doing.
Which they use to kill Ukrainian civilians.
Exactly.
And it's also this is also being spurred, of course, by the threat of Trump. So this is about the US is moving. The US administration is moving. There's a lot of pressure in the US to move now. To try and minimise the risk.
We haven't done any of the stories. I'm very going to quickly go. Jenrick and Badenoch surge in leaders' race was the story we were going to do, which is your big subject, obviously, and Which calling for Oasis ticket refunds. We'll have to talk more later.
See them later.
Oh, my goodness, yes, we will. See you at 11:30 tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Plenty more still to come in the next part of our programme, including Yalda's interview with Antony Blinken. Don't go away.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
You want a job in the